Welcome, dear listeners, to a most curious tale set in the quiet English village of St. Mary Mead, where, beneath the rose-covered cottages and neatly kept gardens, mysteries often lie hidden. Tonight's story is called Miss Marple and the Vanishing Milkman, a cozy detective adventure in the style of Agatha Christie herself. Set in the 1940s, when rationing still lingered and gossip traveled faster than the milk cart, we find our beloved Miss Marple once again relying on her keen eyes and sharper mind to untangle a most peculiar disappearance. So, make yourself comfortable with a cup of tea, and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Vanishing of Mr. Pritchard. It was one of those mornings in late spring when the village of St. Mary Mead looked like a postcard come to life. The hedgerows were brushed with apple blossom, daffodils nodded sleepily in cottage gardens, and a soft mist clung to the meadows beyond. The village itself was still stretching awake. Chimneys puffed the first curls of smoke, and the faint sound of a radio drifted from an open window somewhere down the lane. Miss Jane Marple, spinster of independent means and resident observer of life's intricacies, sat by her parlor window as she so often did. Her knitting needles clicked gently in her hands, a rhythmic accompaniment to the twittering of sparrows on the sill. She was knitting a rather ambitious bedspread for her niece's wedding, and though the pattern was tricky, Miss Marple's mind was quite free to wander, as it always was, to the affairs of her neighbors. From her vantage point, she could see Mrs. Martha Price bustling about her doorstep. Mrs. Price was a stout woman of 50, with a complexion as red as her geraniums. This morning, however, there was a certain agitation in her movements. She peered left and right down the lane, hands planted firmly on her hips, and then stooped to examine her doorstep with an expression of profound disapproval. Miss Marple paused in her knitting. There was nothing on the step, no gleaming bottles of milk waiting to be collected. For 20 years or more, one could set a clock by the arrival of Mr. Albert Pritchard, the milkman. His words, Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. She did not share Mrs. Price's tendency to alarm, but she was inclined to agree that something unusual had occurred. Mr. Pritchard was a man of habits, and habits, Miss Marple well knew, were the most dependable of all indicators of character. People might say one thing and do another, but they rarely altered their daily patterns without good reason. By mid-morning the matter had escalated. Several villagers reported that they, too, had been left milkless. Mrs. Price, who prided herself on efficiency, had already telephoned the dairy. They had confirmed, somewhat anxiously, that Mr. Pritchard had indeed set out on his usual round, horse and cart in order, at precisely 6 o'clock. Since then, however, no word had been received. At 11 o'clock, Constable Harold Harper appeared in the village square, a rather flustered young man in an ill-fitting uniform. He was met at once by a chorus of anxious voices. Mrs. Price, naturally, was the loudest. "Constable, you must do something. A man doesn't simply vanish into thin air." Constable Harper, who had been hoping for a quiet day, attempted reassurance. "No doubt he's delayed." Miss Marple, who had taken a seat on the bench by the church lychgate, observed this exchange with polite interest. She noted the constable's flushed cheeks and uncertain tone. He was a kind enough fellow, but inclined to underestimate the peculiarities of human behavior. Mrs. Bantry leaned towards Miss Marple with a conspiratorial air. "What do you make of it, Jane?" "It's most odd." Miss Marple's needles clicked serenely. "Well, Dolly dear, people do not simply vanish. Particularly not milkmen, who must be among the most regular creatures in existence. If a routine is broken, it is nearly always because something or someone has intervened.
At this precise moment, a boy came running from the direction of Old Mill Field. He was panting heavily, his cap askew. "Constable! Sir! I found the cart! The milk cart's by the field, just standing there!" A ripple of excitement passed through the assembled villagers. Constable Harper straightened, clearly relieved to have something concrete to investigate.
That's dashed peculiar. Left his cart, tied up his horse. Perhaps he stepped away. Mrs. Price let out a dramatic gasp. Stepped away? In the middle of his round? What nonsense! Miss Marple, meanwhile, bent down to examine the ground near the cart. The earth was damp from a recent shower, and clear footprints were visible. A man's boots, she judged, leading away towards the hedgerow, and beside them, curiously, a smaller set, sharper, lighter, a woman's, perhaps, or a boy's. She straightened, her expression mild. It would seem, Constable, that Mr. Pritchard was not alone when he left his cart. The constable looked at her, slightly irritated. He did not much like being shown up by the elderly Miss Marple, though he was far too polite to say so.
"Yes, well, we'll make some inquiries." As the villagers continued to speculate, Mrs. Price insisting upon foul play, Mrs. Bantry wondering if Mr. Pritchard had eloped, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered back over the character of the missing man. Albert Pritchard was no romantic figure, nor a likely runaway. He was a man in his late 40s, quiet, steady, with a fondness for his canary and his evening pint. He had been widowed early in life, and since then had lived in a small cottage on the edge of the village, keeping largely to himself. He had a sister-in-law, Mrs. Clara Pritchard, with whom he was not on the best of terms, owing to a dispute over his late wife's belongings. But beyond that, he had few quarrels and fewer adventures. No, Miss Marple thought, Mr. Pritchard had not vanished by choice. Something had intervened. That evening, the matter was the only subject of conversation at the Blue Boar Inn. The fire crackled, the smell of roasting meat filled the air, and every table buzzed with speculation. "Ran off to London, I'll wager," declared Mr. Sims, the blacksmith. "Plenty of men do when the fancy takes them." "Pritchard? London?" scoffed Mrs. Price. "Don't be absurd. He's no more fit for London than you are for ballet." Young Tommy Briggs, the stable boy, muttered something about seeing Mr. Pritchard arguing with a gentleman the previous day, though nothing could ever disturb their peace. But Miss Marple knew better. Behind every lace curtain, every polished doorstep, human nature ticked away in all its ordinary selfishness, kindness, folly, and greed. And it was in those smallest, most ordinary details that the truth of Mr. Pritchard's disappearance would be found. She smiled faintly, picked up her knitting once more, and thought, "The milkman has vanished, but the truth, I fancy, has not gone far." Chapter 2. Suspects in the Village. The following morning in St. Mary Mead dawned bright and clear, the kind of English spring day when the dew still sparkled on the grass well into breakfast, and the air carried the faintest scent of lilac. Yet, despite the beauty, there was a tension in the village that one could almost taste. For the milkman had not returned, and no word of him had been discovered, despite Constable Harper's earnest inquiries. At 8 o'clock, when most housewives were settling to their morning chores, the square outside the grocer's was crowded with villagers in various states of agitation. Mrs. Price, naturally, had placed herself at the centre of affairs. She was still outraged at the lack of milk, but now she had the additional satisfaction of having predicted calamity. "I said so yesterday, didn't I? Vanished, just like that. A respectable man doesn't disappear unless foul play is at work, and it will come out, mark my words." Her audience murmured their agreement. Even those who disliked Mrs. Price's sharp tongue were inclined to agree with her this once.
Miss Marple stood a little apart, her hands folded neatly on the handle of her basket. She had come ostensibly to buy tea, but in truth she was listening with all her usual quiet attentiveness. For this was the moment when theories began to bloom, and theories, though often wild, had a way of concealing the truth within them. The first name to arise, whispered in corners and spoken aloud by bolder tongues, was that of Mrs. Clara Pritchard, Albert's sister-in-law. Clara had been widowed some years earlier, and since then had lived in a modest cottage just beyond the church. She was a tall, angular woman with an expression of
The second name to be put forward was Tommy Briggs, the stable boy. Tommy was 16, lanky and awkward, with a shock of untidy hair, and a perpetual air of guilt, even when innocent. He had been seen loitering near the milk cart more than once, and there were whispers that he had sticky fingers. He had certainly been caught pinching apples, and old Mr. Giles swore that his tobacco had gone missing whenever Tommy was about. "Milk money's easy pickings," declared Mr. Sims the blacksmith, puffing on his pipe. "And lads like that, they'll do anything for a shilling." "Tommy wouldn't harm a fly," protested Mrs. Bantry, who had a soft spot for wayward boys. "He's just a bit foolish." Miss Marple thought to herself that foolishness and desperation could be a dangerous mixture. Yet she also knew that guilt in expression often had little to do with actual guilt in fact. Tommy's face betrayed his conscience, but whether it was over something serious or merely over a pilfered bun was another matter entirely. The third suspect emerged from a quarrel most of the village had witnessed. Mrs. Edith Price, no relation to Martha, was a woman of sharp words and sharper temper. She had once kept a small dairy herself and was convinced that Mr. Pritchard diluted his milk with water. Only a week ago she had accused him of cheating her voice raised loud enough for passers-by to hear. "I'll report you to the dairy, I will," she had shouted, waving a finger beneath his nose. "You think we don't notice, but I do." It had been the talk of the tea shop for 2 days, and though Mrs. Price was known for exaggeration, some wondered whether her indignation had turned to vengeance. The fourth name was more intriguing. Mr. Gerald Fortescue, the newcomer at the large house on the hill. He had arrived only a few months before, with little explanation and fewer visitors. His household consisted of himself and 2 servants, and yet his orders for milk were curiously large. The dairy boys had noticed it, and gossip had done the rest. "What's he want with all that milk?" demanded Mrs. Price, as though the very thought were indecent. "Perhaps he makes cheese," suggested Mrs. Bantry. Those parcels contained was a matter of conjecture, and conjecture, once begun, rarely lacked for fuel. Constable Harper, trying valiantly to impose order on the chaos, had gathered these rumors into a list. He sat now in the back room of the grocer's with a notebook, attempting to look official. Miss Marple, who had a way of making herself welcome in such places, was nearby with her knitting. She had offered tea to the constable, which he accepted gratefully. "It's a muddle, Miss Marple," he confessed, glancing at his notes. "Clara Pritchard, Tommy Briggs, Mrs. Price, Mr. Fortescue, even the vicar. It can't be all of them, and yet each has a possible motive," Miss Marple finished gently. "Yes, I see that." She knitted quietly for a moment, the needles clicking softly, before adding, "Human nature, Constable, is remarkably repetitive. In every village, in every town, the same patterns appear. Quarrels over inheritance, foolish boys tempted by easy money, resentful customers, secretive newcomers, and clergymen with burdens they do not speak of. The faces change, but the stories remain." The constable looked rather overawed. "Do you mean you think one of them really did something?" "I mean only that we must look closely, Harold. People reveal more than they intend,
especially when they believe they are hiding it. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, basket on her arm, apparently intent on collecting small items from the shop. In reality, she was observing. She saw Mrs. Clara Pritchard hanging out washing, her lips pressed in a thin line as she banged the sheets against the line. There was an air of suppressed anger in the very set of her shoulders. She passed Tommy Briggs, leaning against the wall by the smithy, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He started when he saw her, muttered a greeting, and quickly looked away. At the tea room, she overheard Mrs. Edith Price in full flow, telling anyone who would listen that she had always said Pritchard was a cheat. Her voice was shrill, almost triumphant, as though the milkman's disappearance vindicated her suspicions. Later, near the church, she encountered 5 threads to unravel. She knew from long experience that not all were guilty, and some perhaps not guilty at all. But each must be considered carefully, for truth in St. Mary Mead was rarely where it seemed. She smiled faintly to herself. "Well, Jane," she murmured, "it appears the village has provided you with a puzzle once more." And as the evening bells of the church rang out across the quiet lanes, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily on, weaving pattern into wool, as her mind wove pattern into human nature, already seeking the hidden stitch that would reveal the design. Chapter 3. The Cart and the Clues. The sun had scarcely cleared the tops of the elms the next morning, when Miss Marple, shawl about her shoulders and her straw hat set at its usual precise angle, walked slowly along the lane that led to Old Mill Field. Her step, though light, was deliberate, as though each pace were part of a quiet meditation. In truth, Miss Marple was thinking very hard indeed. The disappearance of Albert Pritchard, the village milkman, had already unsettled St. Mary Mead more thoroughly than a thunderstorm in June. Villagers could scarcely speak of anything else. At the Blue Boar Inn, in the tea room, outside the church gates, everywhere there was speculation, gossip, conjecture. Constable Harper, earnest but not particularly penetrating, had promised to get to the bottom of it, though the bottom, thus far, remained elusive. Miss Marple had, in her usual gentle manner, observed much and spoken little. But she had seen the milk cart yesterday, abandoned at the edge of Old Mill Field, and she wished to see it again, not with a crowd of chattering villagers about, but quietly, with only the morning birds as company. When she reached the field, the dew still lay heavy on the grass, turning each blade into a silver thread in the low light. The cart had been moved from the roadside and stood now near the constable's small outbuilding. But Daisy, the placid horse, was still tethered in the shade of the hawthorn. She gave a low whicker of recognition as Miss Marple approached, for the old lady was known to offer sugar lumps when opportunity presented itself. There, Daisy down its side, leaving a pale smear upon the wood. With the caution of a woman long accustomed to noticing small things, Miss Marple raised the bottle and sniffed delicately. The scent was unmistakable. Milk, yes, but beneath it, faint and bitter, the sharp tang of almonds. Her eyes, a clear blue that belied her years, narrowed thoughtfully. Bitter almonds, she had read, more than once, that such a smell accompanied certain poisons. It had come up in her nephew Raymond's literary circles, where melodramatic tales of arsenic and cyanide were passed about with much enthusiasm. But here, in quiet St. Mary Mead, such a discovery was not merely melodrama. It was alarming. She replaced the bottle with care, her hands steady despite the quickening of her heart. It would not do to leap to conclusions. Still, it was a curious matter. Kneeling with more agility than one might expect, she examined the ground beside the cart.
The rain of 2 nights ago had left the earth soft, and clear impressions remained. She noted again the large boot prints, Mr. Pritchard's, surely, leading away from the cart. But beside them, half overlapping, was a smaller set. The sole was narrower, the heel less worn. A woman's shoe, perhaps, or a young man's. They, too, led toward the hedgerow and then vanished into the longer grass beyond. "Now, who might you have been?" Miss Marple murmured aloud. Behind her, the gate creaked. She rose slowly, smoothing her skirt, and turned to find Constable Harper approaching, notebook in hand, looking slightly harassed. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, somewhat flustered. "Didn't expect to see you out here so early." "I find the morning most conducive to clear thought," Miss Marple replied gently. "And you, Constable? Have you made any progress?" Harper sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not much, I'm afraid. Spoke to Mrs. Clara Pritchard again. She swears she hasn't seen her brother-in-law since Monday. Tommy Briggs says he was nowhere near the cart, though half the village says otherwise. And Mrs. Price, well, she's still going on about watered milk." Miss Marple's lips deceit. A small scrap of paper protruded from beneath the cushion, damp and crumpled. She drew it out delicately, smoothing it between her fingers. It appeared to be a delivery note, the dairy's familiar blue-inked form, but the writing on it was unusual. Instead of the neat columns of household names, it bore a single entry, scrawled hastily: Fortescue, Laboratory, 12 bottles. Her brows rose. Mr. Gerald Fortescue, the newcomer at the manor, was already remarked upon for his extravagant orders, but here was confirmation. 12 bottles in one delivery to a place labeled Laboratory. Miss Marple folded the scrap neatly and tucked it into her pocket. "A curious entry," she remarked aloud, though she did not elaborate. "Eh?" said Harper, distracted. "Only that Mr. Fortescue seems very fond of milk," Miss Marple replied smoothly. "Perhaps he is in poor health. One must never underestimate the peculiarities of diet." She left it at that, though her thoughts were far from casual. Fortescue, with his pale face and chemical smells about the house, suddenly loomed larger in her considerations. As they walked back toward the lane, Harper glanced about uncertainly. "I don't like it, Miss Marple. I don't like it at all. If something has happened to Mr. Pritchard, what do we tell the dairy? What do we tell his customers?" Miss Marple's voice was calm. "We tell them the truth, Constable, that he has not yet been found, and meanwhile, we look very closely indeed at those who had reason to wish him gone." The rest of that day passed in a haze of gossip. At the tea-room, Mrs. Bantry insisted she had once seen Mr. Pritchard delivering a sealed parcel to the Reverend. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price loudly declared she had warned everyone about the watered cream. Tommy Briggs sulked in corners, his ears red from whispered accusations. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, collected these fragments as carefully as she collected scraps of wool for her knitting. Each seemed trivial, but she knew from experience that trivialities often built the strongest case. That evening, as twilight deepened and the swallows dipped low across the fields, she sat by her window with her knitting in her lap. Routines. But Miss Marple knew those routines had been disturbed. And until Mr. Pritchard was found, or his fate uncovered, St. Mary Mead would remain a village with a shadow at its heart. And Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and sharp eyes, intended to see exactly where that shadow led. Chapter 4. Red Herrings in Abundance. The following morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of English summer day that lures gardeners from their beds before the church clock has finished striking 7. St. Mary Mead, however, was a little too distracted to mind its roses or sweet peas. The mystery of Albert Pritchard, the vanished milkman, had taken hold with the ferocity of a late frost. creeping into every conversation and overshadowing even the most beloved gossip. Miss Marple, however, went about her ordinary tasks with an air of serene composure. She watered her geraniums, wrote a letter to her nephew Raymond, which, she reflected, he would no doubt ignore in favor of his literary pursuits, and prepared herself a modest breakfast of boiled egg and toast. Yet, while her hands busied themselves with the familiar rhythms of daily life, her mind turned ceaselessly over the puzzle of the missing milkman. By 10 o'clock she was seated at her favorite corner table in the tea-room, a pot of Darjeeling steamed beside her, and her knitting needles clinked gently as they clicked together. It was an old, well-practiced strategy. Sit, listen, and allow the village to reveal its secrets. Few noticed the elderly lady whose pale blue eyes seemed so innocently occupied by wool and pattern. Sure enough, within minutes Mrs. Price swept in, bustling with self-importance, and lowered herself into the chair opposite. "My dear Miss Marple," she exclaimed, without waiting for permission, "this village will be the end of me. Milk adulterated, milkmen vanishing. It's just as I've always said. Standards are not what they were." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You do have a gift for observation, Mrs. Price." "Observation? Common sense, more like. Why, only last week I told Mrs. Bantry that her cream tasted thin. Thin, I say. And now look what's come about missing collections. And young girls whispered about Gerald Fortescue, who kept late hours in his manor and ordered far too much dairy for a single household. The result was a maze of red herrings, false trails, Miss Marple reflected, that could easily confound anyone less accustomed to the peculiarities of human nature. That afternoon, Constable Harper called at Miss Marple's cottage, his notebook bulging with fresh reports. He looked wearier than ever, his hat pushed back on his head. "I don't know what to make of it, Miss Marple," he confessed, lowering himself into the chair she indicated. "Everywhere I turn, someone's pointing a finger at someone else." "Quite natural," Miss Marple said gently, pouring him a cup of tea. "When people are frightened, suspicion multiplies like weeds in a neglected garden." He gave a tired laugh. "Weeds indeed. Take Mrs. Bantry, for instance. Swears she saw Mr. Pritchard slip a brown paper parcel into the Reverend's hand last Thursday evening, and now she's whispering that the vicar must be mixed up in something shady." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "The vicar? Oh, dear me. I rather think the Reverend Leonard Clement's worst crime is forgetting his umbrella on fine days." Harper chuckled, despite himself. "That's true enough. Then there's young Polly Simmons. Says she overheard Pritchard arguing with his sister-in-law Clara over money. Claims Clara shouted she'd see him gone before she paid another farthing." "That does sound heated," Miss Marple said mildly. "But family quarrels, you know, rarely end in disappearances. Still, one mustn't dismiss it entirely." Harper thumbed his notes. "And here's a queer one. Old Mr. Cartwright swears he saw Gerald Fortescue walking in Old Millfield the very morning the cart was found. Says Fortescue looked pale as death and was carrying a satchel heavy enough to hold a body." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Mr. Cartwright's eyesight, dear Constable, is not quite what it was. Only last week he mistook Mrs. Bantry's terrier for a fox. Still, it is curious. Curious and maddening," Harper sighed. "How am I to sort truth from fancy when everyone's telling tales?" Miss Marple set her teacup down with delicate precision. "By remembering that thrummed through the village like a taut string." At the grocer's she encountered Clara Pritchard, her face pale but composed. Clara was a handsome woman in her 30s, though worry had already etched lines at the corners of her mouth. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pritchard," Miss Marple said warmly. "I hope you're keeping well, despite these trying times." Clara gave a tight smile. "One does one's best, Miss Marple, but I cannot say it's easy, with Albert gone and tongues wagging. I've heard the most dreadful things. That I quarrelled with him, that I wanted him out of the way. Idle gossip, I am sure, Miss Marple replied softly, though people do so enjoy embroidering stories. I dare say they will tire of it soon. Clara's eyes flashed. It isn't fair. Albert may have had faults, who doesn't? But he was my husband's brother, and I'd never wish him harm. Of course not, my dear. Miss Marple touched her arm kindly. Yet inwardly she noted the defensiveness, the sudden flare of anger. Guilt or simply wounded pride? It was sometimes difficult to tell. That evening brought another small revelation. Miss Marple, walking home across the green, noticed Tommy Briggs loitering near the lich gate. The boy's face was pale beneath its freckles, his eyes darting about nervously. "Good evening, Tommy," she said as if by chance. "Out rather late, aren't you?" Tommy shuffled. Just getting some air, miss." "Fresh air is important," she agreed, her tone mild. "Though I do wonder why you avoided the constable's questions yesterday." His ears reddened. "I didn't avoid 'em. I just didn't have anything to say." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You saw the milk cart, though, and perhaps more than that. It can be difficult, keeping such things to oneself." For a moment, Tommy looked as though he might bolt. Then his shoulders slumped. "I did see someone. Not Albert, someone else, near the cart. But if I say who, they'll call me a liar like always." "Not if you tell me quietly," Miss Marple assured him. He hesitated, then whispered, "It was Mr. Fortescue's hands, steady and sure, though its design was not yet revealed. Somewhere in the midst of gossip, quarrels, and whispered accusations lay the answer to Albert Pritchard's disappearance. The trick, as always, was to know which details belonged to the pattern and which were merely decoration. Miss Marple, with her clear eyes and quiet patience, meant to find out. Chapter 5. Shadows at the Manor. The following morning broke soft and golden, the kind of morning in which the bells of St. Mary Mead rang cheerily over hedgerows, and housewives paused at their washing lines to listen. Yet despite the peaceful air, an undercurrent of unease pulsed through the village. The milkman had still not been found, and each day without news seemed to stretch the mystery tauter, like a violin string wound too tightly. Miss Marple, however, did not appear troubled. After her customary breakfast of porridge and stewed plums, she adjusted her hat, drew her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, and set off toward the lane leading to Fortescue Manor. It was not mere curiosity that drew her there. The scrap of paper she had found beneath the cart seat still lay folded in her knitting basket. Fortescue, Laboratory, 12 bottles. A peculiar entry indeed, and in Miss Marple's long experience, peculiarity was very often the herald of truth. The manor stood somewhat apart from the rest of St. Mary Mead, its gates flanked by moss-grown stone pillars. The house itself, a fine Georgian structure of mellow brick, had in recent months acquired a faintly forbidding air. Curtains were often drawn in daylight hours, and deliveries of odd crates had been observed by more than one curious villager. Miss Marple walked up the gravel drive at her usual unhurried pace. She had, after all, once been introduced to Mr. Gerald Fortescue at the vicarage tea, and propriety allowed her to pay a call under the guise of neighborly courtesy. A manservant, thin, gray, and unsmiling, answered her knock. "Good morning," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Would you be so kind as to tell Mr. Fortescue that Miss Marple of the village is here to see him?" The servant gave her a long, appraising look before bowing stiffly. "Very well, madam. If you will wait in the hall was cool and shadowed, its walls lined with somber portraits." Miss Marple took in the faint chemical tang that hung in the air. She had smelt such things before in her youth, when a cousin had dabbled in photography. but here the odor was stronger, sharper. At length Gerald Fortescue appeared. He was a tall Fortescue. I observe. For instance, I observe that your household takes in an unusually large quantity of milk. Fortescue's expression did not flicker, though his fingers tightened on the back of a chair. I conduct experiments, he said after a pause, scientific work of some delicacy. Milk happens to be necessary to it. Experiments, Miss Marple repeated mildly. How very interesting. I do hope you are careful. Chemicals, I believe, can sometimes be most dangerous things. His eyes flashed, but only for a moment. I assure you, Miss Marple, I know precisely what I am about. There was a silence, filled only by the faint tick of a long-case clock. Miss Marple allowed the pause to lengthen, her needles quietly clicking as she resumed her knitting. The gentle sound seemed oddly at home in the cold hall, and after a time it was Fortescue who spoke again. You must forgive me, he said abruptly. I have little patience for village gossip. My work requires solitude. Quite understandable, Miss Marple said calmly. Yet you must admit, secrecy often encourages gossip. People will fill a void with all manner of invention. I myself prefer to rely only upon what is before my eyes. And what, Fortescue asked with a faint edge, is before your eyes now? A gentleman, Miss Marple replied serenely, who is devoted to his work, but perhaps a trifle careless about how it appears to others. That can be unfortunate. Fortescue gave a short laugh, sharp as glass. Unfortunate indeed. Well, Miss Marple, if you have satisfied your curiosity, I must return to my laboratory. He bowed again, and the servant reappeared, ushering her back down the hall. Yet Miss Marple's eyes had already taken note of several things: the faint dusting of white powder near the edge of the servant's cuff, the set of keys hanging from Fortescue's belt, and, most intriguing of all, a half-empty bottle of milk standing on the sideboard, its stopper loose. As she walked homeward, Miss Marple turned these details over in her mind. Fortescue was undoubtedly a man of intelligence, perhaps even brilliance, but brilliance could be dangerous when paired with secrecy, and sponge cake. But her mind remained on Fortescue. Cages, glassware, chemicals, and milk, in great quantities. It was a curious picture indeed, yet she reminded herself not to leap at shadows. Appearances could mislead, as they so often did. Evening fell, cool and quiet. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting spread across her lap, and reflected upon what she had learned. Gerald Fortescue was secretive, yes. He ordered milk in quantities that defied reason, yes. And he had been seen by more than one villager near Old Mill Field. All of this painted him in suspicious colors, but Miss Marple knew the dangers of too neat an answer. Villages thrived on pointing fingers at outsiders, and Fortescue, with his aloof manner and strange habits, was the perfect scapegoat. The real question, she thought, was not who looked guilty, but who benefited from Albert Pritchard's disappearance. That was the thread she must tug, the pattern she must discern. Her needles clicked softly, the fire flickered, and the shadows deepened about her. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the truth waited, hidden beneath layers of gossip and supposition, and Miss Marple, patient and precise, intended to uncover it, no matter how many shadows lay at the manor's door. Chapter 6. False Steps and Faint Traces. The next day, the weather shifted. A gray pall hung over St. Mary Mead, the kind of English summer day that promised rain, but offered only a clammy mist instead. The village green looked dull and sodden, and even the sparrows seemed disheartened, huddling in the hedges instead of darting merrily about. It was a fitting backdrop, Miss Marple thought, for a mystery that seemed to be growing more tangled by the hour. She had resolved, over her early tea, to take a closer look at those whose names had been most freely mentioned in connection with Albert Pritchard's disappearance. Gerald Fortescue and his strange laboratory, of course, occupied much of the village imagination. But Miss Marple knew well that the most suspicious-seeming people were often innocent, while the quiet and ordinary hid the darkest secrets. "Begin," she murmured to herself, stirring her tea, "with the Reverend Clement. He is a good man, but not immune to village speculation." Ago learnt that guile did not always leave marks on the surface. "My dear Miss Marple," he said warmly, "you are most welcome, though I fear you come to speak of poor Pritchard, do you not?" "I do indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "You see, rumors abound, one of which suggests you were seen receiving a parcel from him last Thursday evening." The vicar blinked. "A parcel? From Pritchard? My dear lady, that is most curious." He frowned as if trying to recall. "Ah, yes, I remember now. He did hand me a package, but it was nothing remarkable, merely a bundle of hymn sheets from the printer. Pritchard was passing by and offered to deliver them on his way." Mrs. Clement beamed. "That's Albert all over, always obliging. And now people are making it sound like some dark transaction." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap as she nodded. "Village tongues are apt to embroider, I fear. Thank you for clarifying, Reverend. It is most reassuring." Yet, as she left the vicarage, she reflected that while the Reverend's explanation was perfectly plausible, it did little to narrow the field. If anything, it confirmed how easily gossip spun shadows from nothing. Her next call was to Clara Pritchard. Clara received her in the little parlor of her cottage, looking pale and drawn. A pile of bills lay upon the table, half covered by a dish towel. "Forgive the mess, Miss Marple," Clara said quickly. "I've been trying to get the accounts in order. Albert was always better at such things than I." Miss Marple's kind eyes softened. "It must be very trying for you, my dear. And of course, people's thoughtless chatter cannot help." Clara's lips tightened. "You mean the talk that I quarreled with him?" "Yes, I've heard. I dare say everyone has. They make it sound as though I wished him dead, simply because I told him I could not keep lending him money." "You did quarrel then?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle, almost motherly. Clara flushed. "Only as families do. Albert, he had a way of spending beyond his means, and he could be careless. I told him I would not cover his debts again, but that was all. I never dreamed he would vanish." Her eyes filled with sudden tears, and Miss Marple. "You look rather downcast," she observed. He scowled. "Everyone thinks I had something to do with it, just 'cause I hang about the cart sometimes." "Unjust indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "But tell me, Tommy, you mentioned seeing Mr. Fortescue near the cart. Was it truly him?" Tommy hesitated, then shrugged. "Looked like him, anyway. Tall, thin, carrying a bag. But maybe it weren't. Hard to be sure in the morning mist." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Quite so. Mist can play curious tricks on the eyes." Tommy glanced at her uneasily. "You don't think I'm lying?" "Not at all, my dear boy. I think you saw something unusual, and you've been very brave to speak of it. But unusual things do not always mean sinister things." He seemed relieved, though not entirely convinced. Miss Marple, however, tucked away the detail. A bag, heavy enough to draw attention. If Fortescue had indeed carried such a thing, what had it contained? That evening, as dusk fell, Miss Marple sat by her hearth with her knitting and reviewed the day's findings. The Reverend was innocent of parcels. Clara admitted to quarrels, but not malice. And Tommy's story was blurred by mist and uncertainty. Each clue, instead of sharpening the picture, seemed to blur it further, like ink running on damp paper. False steps, she thought. Faint traces, just enough to lead one astray, and yet Patterns were beginning to emerge. The milk cart with its tainted bottle, the curious laboratory at the manor, the quarrels over money, all these threads wove a design, though its shape was not yet clear. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, the firelight playing over her serene face. Most would have thought her absorbed in knitting, her mind on nothing more complex than the arrangement of stitches. But, in truth, she was considering the darker side of human nature, and how it so often hid beneath the appearance of respectability. Someone, she murmured to herself, knows precisely what became of Albert Pritchard, and soon an villager felt entitled to an opinion, each more elaborate than the last. Some declared Albert had fled with a secret fortune. Others insisted he had been done away with by smugglers, though St. Mary Mead lay miles from the sea. A few whispered darkly about Gerald Fortescue and his unnatural sciences. Miss Marple, however, was less interested in speculation than in connections. Over the past days, she had gathered scraps of information like a thrifty housewife hoarding ends of wool. Now she began to see how the colours might be knitted into a single pattern. She began her day with a visit to the grocer's. Mrs. Price was, as always, at the counter, lecturing poor Mr. Hargreaves on the perils of watered cream. "My dear Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said gently, "you do take such care for our village standards. But tell me, have you noticed anything unusual in Albert's accounts? You are so observant, I am sure you must have." Mrs. Price preened a little. "Well, since you ask, Miss Marple, I did notice. Only last week Albert confided, yes, confided, that he'd been asked to deliver milk to the manor in quite extraordinary quantities. 12 bottles at a time, if you'll believe it." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, her eyes mild. "That is unusual. And between you and me," Mrs. Price lowered her voice, "he didn't like it. Said there was something unnatural about the way Mr. Fortescue demanded his milk fresh from the morning churn, and sealed too. Albert thought it was wasteful. Wasteful! And Albert was not a man to waste." Miss Marple tucked the detail away. Albert had voiced unease about the manor deliveries. That unease might explain why his last note mentioned Fortescue's laboratory. Later that morning, Constable Harper stopped by, his boots muddy and his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've just come from Old Millfield again. We combed the hedges, the ditches, the coppice, nothing. It's as if Pritchard walked off the face of the earth." Miss Marple poured him tea, her manner calm. "Not off the earth, Constable. Only into some corner we have not yet considered." He sighed, taking the cup gratefully. "Just a muddle." "Life often looks a muddle, Constable. But muddles are simply patterns we have not yet unravelled." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the dairy itself. The place smelled of fresh cream and churned butter, and the clatter of pails echoed through the cool, tiled room. Mr. Ellis, the dairy manager, was a round, red-faced man with a ready smile. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "what a pleasure! Though I dare say you've come about poor Pritchard, eh? A terrible business, terrible." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple replied. "I wondered if you might show me his delivery book. One so often finds small details useful." Of course," said Ellis, bustling to a desk. He produced a ledger thick with entries. "Albert was the most reliable man I ever had. Never missed a round, never muddled an order." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the book. Names and numbers marched neatly down the page. Mrs. Bantry, 3 bottles. Mrs. Price, 2. The vicarage, 4. But at the bottom of the list stood a larger entry. Fortescue, 12 bottles. She tapped the line delicately. "And this order, how long has it been placed?" "Why, for the last month or 2, Ellis said. "Odd, isn't it? I asked Albert if we should deliver in bulk. But he said Fortescue insisted on it being brought round with the morning round, just like the others. Paid promptly, mind, so I can't complain. Still, Albert seemed uneasy about it. Uneasy? Yes. He said something about bottles being returned not quite right, seals broken, residue inside. I told him not to fuss, but Ellis shrugged. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently. "Thank you, Mr. Ellis. You've been most helpful." As she walked back through the village, her mind turned over this fresh information. Bottles returned with residue, seals broken. Albert had noticed and perhaps spoken of it too freely. Could that have sealed his fate? That evening, Miss Marple was not surprised when Mrs. Bantry swept into her cottage without so much as a knock. "My dear Jane, I must tell you at once. Gerald Fortescue has been seen again, late at night, carrying a lantern across the field toward the manor. Mrs. Bart—"
Another. But one thing stood clear. Albert Pritchard had stumbled into something beyond his ordinary routine. Whether it was Fortescue's experiments, Clara's debts, or some other hidden matter, he had noticed too much. "Poor Albert," Miss Marple murmured. "Too honest for secrecy, too ordinary to survive extraordinary things. But if someone thought to silence him, they must reckon also with me." Her needles resumed their steady clicking, each stitch as deliberate as her thoughts. Somewhere, in the midst of gossip and half-truths, lay the one fact that would reveal everything. She had only to be patient, and the pattern would declare itself. And, when it did, Miss Marple would be ready. Chapter 8. The Bitter Taste of Truth. This week, the following morning dawned with a pale sun breaking through ragged clouds. The mist of previous days had lifted, leaving the hedgerows sparkling with dew and the air sharp and clear. St. Mary Mead seemed to have shaken itself awake, though the villagers' talk had lost none of its murmur. They spoke of Albert Pritchard in lowered tones now, as though some shared foreboding had begun to settle in their hearts. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. She was not one to waste the brightness of a fine morning. And besides, her mind had been troubled in the night. The pattern of her thoughts, like her knitting, had begun to take a clearer shape. Something was wrong. Something small, easily overlooked, yet niggling at her with persistence. She breakfasted lightly, tied her bonnet, and went out to walk. As she passed through the village, she paused at every gate, smiling at the housewives, sweeping their steps or pegging laundry. She asked about their milk deliveries with the same mild curiosity that made her a favorite confidant. "Always fresh," said Mrs. Price briskly. "Though not since Albert went missing, of course. This new lad, he sloshes it about something dreadful." "Quite true," added Mrs. Bartlett, pegging a sheet to her line. "Albert never spilled a drop, and he'd always leave the bottle in the shade, if there was any, so it wouldn't sour." Miss Marple nodded, thanking them kindly. "Small details, yes." "A moment," she replied mildly. "I hear you have been purchasing milk in quite unusual quantities. 12 bottles a day, I believe?" Fortescue's eyes flickered. "And what concern is that of yours?" "None of mine, of course," Miss Marple said sweetly. "But Albert Pritchard, who delivered it, has vanished. And one cannot help wondering if there is some connection." For a long moment, Fortescue studied her. Then, to her surprise, he laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "My dear lady, if you think I am hiding your milkman in my cellar, you are gravely mistaken. I require milk for experiments, nothing more. Perfectly legitimate, though perhaps beyond your comprehension. Experiments?" He gave a thin smile. "Bacterial cultures. Fermentation studies you would not understand. Suffice it to say, Pritchard's disappearance has nothing to do with me." Miss Marple inclined her head, unfazed.
I see. Thank you, Mr. Fortescue. You are most kind. She turned to go, her expression serene. But as she walked away down the lane, her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Fortescue had protested too quickly, too sharply, and there was something in the way he had said fermentation that pricked her mind. That afternoon, Miss Marple went to see Clara Pritchard again. The poor woman looked even paler than before, her hands trembling as she folded laundry. "Clara, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "do you recall if Albert mentioned anything odd about his work of late?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he did. Only a few days before he disappeared, he told me one of the bottles he collected from Fortescue's Manor smelled strange. Bitter, he said, as though something had been mixed with it. He meant to speak to Mr. Ellis at the dairy about it. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settle in her mind. Bitter. That was the word that had troubled her in the night. Bitter milk, bitter taste, an everyday clue, yet pointing toward something dark. "Thank you, Clara," she said softly. "That is most helpful." Her next stop was the dairy. Mr. Ellis was bustling about with churns, but he looked up eagerly when Miss Marple entered. Looked up, sweat streaking his forehead. "Hello, Miss Marple." "Good afternoon, Tommy." "I wonder, when you saw that tall man with a bag in the mist, do you recall if he seemed to walk towards the manor?" Tommy squinted, thinking. I reckon he did. Bag looked heavy, though. He carried it like it were full of bottles." "Bottles," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Thank you, Tommy. You've been most helpful." By the time evening fell, Miss Marple's thoughts had crystallized. She sat by her fire, knitting forgotten in her lap, and considered what she had learnt. Albert had discovered that Fortescue's bottles contained more than milk. He had noticed and spoken of it, perhaps too freely. And then he had vanished, leaving behind his horse and cart, as though taken by surprise. The bitter taste of the bottles was no accident. Fortescue, with his experiments, had been using milk as a cover for something far more dangerous. And Albert, honest, ordinary Albert, had seen too much. The threads had tightened into a knot, and Miss Marple knew that very soon she must tug that knot loose and reveal the truth to all. But as she sat in the quiet parlour, the fire crackling and the shadows lengthening, Miss Marple's eyes softened with sadness. "Poor Albert," she murmured. "It was not in him to dissemble. He saw what was wrong and could not look away, and for that he paid dearly." Her needles resumed their quiet clicking, each stitch steady and deliberate. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring confrontation, and when it came, she would be ready. For in the bitter taste of truth lay the answer to the mystery of the Vanishing Milkman. Chapter 9. The Confrontation at the Manor. The sky over St. Mary Mead was heavy with low clouds when Miss Marple set out that afternoon. The air carried a damp chill, the sort that pressed against one's skin and made the hedgerows look darker, the cottages smaller. It was not a day for pleasant rambles or gossip on the green. It was a day for truths to be spoken. Miss Marple had spent the morning writing 3 notes in her careful hand, few to permit a few more guests. Even Fortescue, though clearly irked, could hardly refuse. And so it was that Clara Pritchard arrived, pale and trembling, followed by the Reverend Clement, steady but concerned. Finally Constable Harper appeared, notebook in hand, his expression wary. Mrs. Bantry came too, though not invited, having heard rumours of a gathering and deciding she would sooner expire than miss it. The group assembled in Fortescue's dim study, a room lined with dusty books and smelling faintly of chemicals. Fortescue stood near the hearth, his long fingers tapping the mantelpiece. Clara sat stiffly in a chair, clutching a handkerchief. The Reverend looked solemn, and Harper poised his pencil expectantly. Mrs. Bantry, of course, hovered with keen anticipation, her eyes darting from face to face. Miss Marple remained by the window, her knitting bag at her side. She looked, as ever, perfectly placid. "My friends," she began gently, "we are gathered because Albert Pritchard has disappeared. The village is troubled and rumours abound. But I believe the truth may be discovered if we consider matters carefully." Clara gave a soft sob. Harper cleared his throat. Fortescue's lips curled in faint disdain. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. Albert was a simple man, but observant. He noticed things, small things, that others might overlook. And one of those things was the condition of the bottles he delivered here to the manor. At this Fortescue stiffened. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "The bottles were returned with seals broken, with residue inside, with a bitter taste clinging to them. Albert remarked upon it, both to his wife and to Mr. Ellis at the dairy. It troubled him. He thought, perhaps, that something improper was being done." Fortescue spoke, his tone sharp. "I told you already, experiments. Perfectly legitimate." "Indeed," said Miss Marple serenely, "but legitimate experiments need not be conducted in secrecy, nor leave bitter traces in the milk of one's neighbours. You see, I believe Albert suspected poison. He may—"
Mantelpiece. "Moreover," Miss Marple went on, her voice gaining a quiet authority, "young Tommy Briggs saw a tall man carrying a heavy bag that very morning, moving through the mist toward the manor. He thought little of it, but a bag filled with bottles or something to be disposed of would fit the image well enough." There was a long silence. Only the ticking of the clock on the mantel broke it. Clara found her voice first. Trembling, Then Albert is—" Miss Marple looked at her with infinite gentleness. "I fear so, my dear. Albert discovered too much. He realized something dangerous was being mixed with the milk. Perhaps he intended to speak of it, to warn others. Mr. Fortescue could not allow that. He summoned Albert to the field under some pretext. Albert trusted him, went willingly, and never returned." Constable Harper spoke gruffly. "You're saying Fortescue murdered him? What with? Where's the body?" Miss Marple's eyes were sharp now. "The body, I suspect, was placed in that very bag. Fortescue has laboratories, cellars, places of concealment. As for the method, well, one need only recall Albert's words. The milk tasted bitter. Many poisons are bitter." Fortescue straightened, his face pale with fury. "This is slander, idle village gossip, dressed up as deduction." But Miss Marple only smiled, her voice quiet but steady. "It is not gossip, Mr. Fortescue. It is human nature. You hid behind your science, thinking no one would notice. But Albert noticed. And now we all see the pattern clearly." Harper stepped forward, his voice firm. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to accompany me. There'll be a full search of this house, and if Miss Marple is right, we'll find what you've hidden." Fortescue's mouth opened, then shut again. His hands trembled, and for a moment his cold mask slipped, revealing the fear beneath. Mrs. Bantry gave a little gasp of triumph, as though she herself had solved the matter. The Reverend bowed his head, murmuring a prayer for Albert's soul.
But Albert Pritchard and the dreadful revelations at the manor. Some claim to have always suspected Fortescue, his aloof manner, his talk of science, his secretive habits. Others confessed they had thought Clara guilty, or Tommy Briggs, or even poor Reverend Clement. Each conversation buzzed with hindsight certainty, as though the entire village had solved the mystery together. But in her snug little cottage, Miss Marple sat serenely by her fireside, pouring tea for a select few. Mrs. Bantry, Reverend Clement, Clara Pritchard, Constable Harper, and young Tommy Briggs, who had been included at Miss Marple's insistence. The room was warm, the table spread with scones, jam, and seed cake. Outside, the world might still be reeling, but inside there was comfort and calm. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, helping herself to a scone, "you must explain it all properly. Everyone is talking at once, and the facts are hopelessly muddled. Did Fortescue really poison the milk, or was it something else entirely?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles resting quietly in her lap. "I shall do my best, Dolly, but do remember, it is the small things, the ordinary things, that revealed the truth." Albert noticed them, though he may not have understood their significance. Clara dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. She looked pale still, but calmer, grateful to be among friends. "Please, Miss Marple, I must know what really happened to Albert." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Yes, my dear, and you have every right to know. Albert was honest, conscientious, and observant. He saw that something was amiss with the milk bottles he collected from the manor. Seals broken, bitter residue inside. He remarked upon it more than once, and that was his undoing." Constable Harper leaned forward. "So the poison was real then? I thought at first it might be some chemical for Fortescue's experiments." "It was both," Miss Marple replied. "Fortescue was conducting experiments in fermentation, so he claimed. But he had gone further than that. He was testing dangerous compounds, using the milk as a medium. When Albert noticed, Fortescue feared exposure, and exposure, you see, would have ruined him, not only his reputation, but his freedom."
Would have thought it simply turned sour. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Exactly, Dolly. Most would assume sourness. But Albert said bitter. A very different matter. Sour milk is natural. Bitter milk suggests something added. That single word rang in my ears, and when I remembered Fortescue's great quantities of milk, 12 bottles a day, I saw it must be linked." Harper grunted. "I'll admit, Miss Marple, I hadn't thought of that. I was looking for tracks in the mud, signs of a struggle. But you found the truth in a taste." Miss Marple smiled gently. "One must always listen carefully, Constable. Human nature reveals itself in trifles." Clara looked up suddenly. "But why summon Albert to Old Mill Field? Why not simply deal with him at the manor?" "Because Albert trusted him," Miss Marple explained. "Fortescue needed Albert to step away from his cart, willingly, without alarm. The field was secluded, yet near enough to the road for Albert not to suspect danger. Fortescue likely claimed he needed help carrying a package. Albert agreed, tethered his horse and went with him. That was the last anyone saw of him." Clara shivered, but there was gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It helps, knowing he was trying to do right, that he noticed what others ignored. He was a good man," Miss Marple said softly, "and that will be remembered." Tommy Briggs, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly blurted, "Then I wasn't just imagining things. I did see him with that bag." "Indeed you did," Miss Marple said kindly. "You were very observant, and very brave to speak of it, even when others doubted you. You helped more than you know." Tommy blushed fiercely, ducking his head. The Reverend smiled at him, and even Constable Harper gave a nod of approval. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. "Well, I never! Tommy a hero, Albert vindicated, Fortescue unmasked. It is all quite thrilling. Though, of course, one is terribly sorry for poor Albert." "Quite," said Miss Marple, her voice quiet. For a while they sipped tea in thoughtful silence,
broken only by the crackle of the fire and the click of Miss Marple's needles.
Constable. It isn't about cleverness. It is about human nature. People are much the same everywhere, whether in St. Mary Mead or in London. Pride, greed, fear. These are the motives, always. One need only notice how they show themselves in the everyday. When at last the gathering broke up, Clara lingered. She took Miss Marple's hand in hers, pressing it with quiet earnestness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving Albert back his good name." For making them see, Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "He was a good man. Remember that, and let it comfort you. Time will do the rest." Clara left then, her shoulders a little straighter than when she had come. As the afternoon light softened into evening, Miss Marple remained by the fire, alone once more. She picked up her knitting, the familiar rhythm soothing her thoughts. Another mystery laid to rest, another shadow lifted from the village. She thought of Albert, honest and ordinary, who had noticed a taste others would have ignored. She thought of Clara, who must now rebuild her life. She thought of young Tommy, who had glimpsed truth through the mist. And she thought with quiet certainty that life in St. Mary Mead would soon return to its usual rhythm of teas, gardens, and gentle gossip. Yet beneath it all, she knew human nature would remain what it always was, capable of kindness, yes, but also of pride, folly, and darker things. And so long as that was true, there would always be mysteries to unravel, even in the most peaceful of villages. Her needles clicked on, steady as the beating of her heart. The fire glowed, the clock ticked, the kettle sang softly on the hob. Outside, twilight settled gently over St. Mary Mead, enfolding it in quiet peace, and, in her little parlor, Miss Marple smiled, content. "Thank you."